incredibly successful Erickson was at working with people, and how it was almost like magic.
He saw things that seemed to be coming from left field or marginalized. And he would realize that that thing that he saw, that idea in the margin, was really where the deep story could be evoked.
It was completely different, more like following Socrates around while he discussed things than it was going to a university class.
If you tried to interview him, you ended up getting therapy. He had a lot of physical pain. So my guess is that that internal pain drove his attention externally.
I think there is a lot of communication that goes on between people that certainly is below the level of awareness, and I'm sure that's it, but it seemed much more precise and specific communication than that kind of communication allows. So, I know he didn't believe he was psychic, but he seemed psychic sometimes.
He was profoundly aware of the shifts of consciousness that people have. He really reframed the idea of, quote, the unconscious.
I said to him, I've never had a positive hallucination. And he said, now, why would you want to see yourself sitting over there in that chair? That's all he needed to do.
He was quite a controversial character early on.
I'd like to have you explain this one little thing.
I think we've all acknowledged the influence he's had in our life, directly or indirectly. So anyone who wants to know what does it take to create change in short periods of time, you got to look around and you got to say there's only a few people that have been able to consistently do that and produce those results, and Erickson's one of them.
Hello, my name is Alexander Vesely. I'm here today to introduce you to a man who changed the face of psychotherapy around the world in ways that cannot be measured. Born in 1901, Milton Erickson was the most powerful hypnotist of the 20th century. Like Mesmer, Charcot, or Rasputin before him, he could provoke uncanny changes in people using the powerful and somewhat mysterious therapeutic tool known as hypnosis. But unlike his colleagues in history, Erickson was a scientist who brought us a new understanding of how change can occur within an individual. Described as the Mozart of communication by his friend, the legendary Gregory Bateson, Milton Erickson became known for his seemingly magical ability to swiftly treat conditions others found untreatable. Erickson's uncommon approach to psychotherapeutic practice broke with all the established norms and caused much controversy within the psychiatric community. Like many pioneers, Erickson developed his ideas out of necessity. Left paralyzed from severe polio, which struck him at age 17, the former high school athletic champion discovered new ways to tap into the vast resources of the unconscious mind and, defying doctors' predictions, not only survived but regained almost complete control over his body. While Erickson is most known for his innovative work in hypnosis, his impact extends far beyond that. Just as he had transformed his body frozen by disease, he transformed the static, scripted protocols of mental healing. Recognizing each person as an individual whose own internal resources can be used to create unique pathways to change, Erickson introduced a powerful alternative to traditional long-term therapy approaches. His idea of utilization has been recognized as one of the most important contributions to psychotherapy and continues to resonate with all who come in contact with his work. Erickson ushered in an age where brief interventions that help people realize their potential to fulfill future dreams are the emphasis and powerful new direction of psychotherapy. For 3 years, I collected the personal impressions and memories of people who studied with him, saw his work firsthand, and benefited from his creative thinking. Join me as we experience, up close and personal, one of the 20th century's greatest thinkers.
They went out west in a covered wagon, my mother did. He still worked in the mines until that mine was wore out. Davis, that was his boss. Milton was born out there. They didn't have doctors. They had midwives.
Simon Davis and Grandpa built a house up Silver Canyon, and they built a house with one wall, the mountain, and then a sloped roof. There's a very good chance that this was the house where my father was born. It resembles so much the house that Grandpa described at the head of the canyon.
The difficulty of the conditions and how hard it was. I think that is one of the reasons why he appreciated using everything that was available. That was the background that he came from. Appreciate what you've got and put it to its best use.
One day, Grandpa and Mr. Davis came back from the mine. Grandpa came in the door and lunch was on the table. But Grandma wasn't right there, but they're hungry miners. They sat down and started eating. Then all of a sudden, Grandpa heard a cry in the bedroom and got up and went in the bedroom to see his wife. And there he is with his brand new boy, which they named Milton, who eventually would be Milton Erickson, their doctor's son.
He was born different. He was born with a number of congenital problems. He had color blindness, his atonality. He would hear people singing, and he wondered what was all that screeching and why did people enjoy it?
He was tone deaf and colorblind. He could distinguish purple, so that's why he always wore purple.
He began to notice from childhood the differences between his perceptions and the perceptions of others around him. No one was able to tell him that you are different. He had to figure this out himself. So he would tell me many anecdotes from his childhood, how his father would be trying to pull a donkey into a barn, and Erickson would get an idea, and he would walk up to the donkey while his father's trying to pull it into the barn. Little boy Erickson would go up to the donkey and pull on its tail, and the donkey wants to get away from the little boy, and so he runs, almost tramples over his father to get into the barn. So these were aspects of his native, ingenuity, cleverness, and he always took pride in this.
When he started school, he discovered that he had what we would now call a learning disability. Letters were often reversed for him, and he had great difficulty, for instance, discerning an E from an M. One day, one of his teachers very sagely suggested, since this was in a rural environment, and everybody was, of course, familiar with horses, is that maybe he could conceptualize the M as a horse grazing, a horse on the ground, and the E as a horse that had raised up and was rearing. And Erickson said there was a blinding flash of light, of realization, and of acknowledgement, and of insight that struck him at the time that his teacher said that.
I said, "What are you telling me, Milton? Did you have a hallucination as a child?" He says, "I don't know, but it was like a blinding flash of light, like an atomic bomb."
Erickson had a very early experience with utilization, and he carried this principle and this way of teaching and this way of conducting therapy for the rest of his life.
they bought a farm in Wisconsin. All their income was from their cows, the milk from their cows, and chickens if they sold some eggs. Most of the time, he was in his bedroom reading and studying. I can remember my mother distinctly saying, he's busy reading the dictionary. I was 5 when he had infantile paralysis. And that was the worst case the doctor had seen, because it was just 2 inches from hitting his heart and paralyzing him.
Back in those days, of course, polio was a horribly fearsome disease, and many people died from it. Many people were permanently disabled from it.
His local doctor, who's in the rural area, it's a very small town, thinks it's polio, but he's not sure. He's not that experienced at it. So he calls in the specialists from the city. 3 doctors come out from the city, and they examine him. And Erickson's quite sick. He has that polio fever. And they step just outside of the door to his room, and they tell his mother, yes, it's polio, and the boy's going to die tonight. Erickson became so angry that these doctors would say so, matter-of-factly, your son's going to die. He got so angry at them. He vowed that he would live through the night and prove those city slicker doctors wrong. And he did live through the night with great difficulty. Almost died a few times, but lived through the night. In the morning, with his creaky voice, he can barely speak because now he's becoming paralyzed and, hasn't had much water through the night. He croaks at his family, and he insists that they move his dresser, which has a mirror on it, so that he gets to see the sunrise, to prove those doctors wrong. If he sees the sunrise, he's lived through the night. To prove those doctors wrong, he wants him to maneuver, and they're really perplexed by this. He's so insistent. And he sees the sunrise, and he's lived another day.
It was after that that Erickson lapsed into a coma, and he didn't wake up until 3 days later and was pretty much paralyzed in his whole body.
He can still blink his eyes. He can talk just a little. But he's paralyzed. But he's still got an active mind, 17 years old. And he's trapped in this body that's not moving very much. He used to be an active kid, as most kids are. And he's stuck in bed. There's nothing else. There's no television, no radios at the time. He has to keep his mind active, so he starts to pay attention, like other people don't pay attention. And he becomes like Sherlock Holmes.
He spent his whole days watching people, watching brothers and sisters in the whole activity in the household. He saw that what people said and what their bodies said didn't always match.
He would be able to judge whose footsteps he heard outside when they were going between the barn and the house. How fast they were walking would give him an indication of what emotional state that were they in. Were they upset? Were they tired? Were they anxious to have dinner that night?
His acuity became amplified, compared to which most of us are deaf, dumb, and blind.
He got a little, bed sores being in the bed. So they fixed up a wicker rocking chair with just this kind of mesh bottom, and they strapped him to it because he'd fall out because he couldn't control his muscles.
And they generally put him close to a window where you could at least look out at the farm and enjoy the scenery, but they had forgotten this day, and he was in the middle of the room, and he was lamenting to himself, it sure would be nice if I was closer to the window.
He closes his eyes, and just to keep his mind active, he remembers being out playing in the farm, climbing the tree that was right outside his window, and he just got so involved in this memory of running and playing and climbing. And the next thing he does is, hours later, he opens his eyes, and his chair had started by the side of the bed, and now it was over in front of the window. And at first he was perplexed, and then he sort of worked it out again, that Sherlock Holmes kind of observation. He started to get involved in the remembering of running and playing and climbing. And he looked down at his arms, and he could see that one of his arms was getting a little redder, more blood flow perhaps. Now he couldn't consciously control his muscles, but as he remembered reaching up for the next rung on the tree, or the ladder up to the tree, he noticed his arm moved a little. It was a muscle memory. He couldn't move consciously, but non-consciously, he could evoke the memory of movement which would move him, and it must have started to move his body in such a way that the chair rocked and moved a little at a time over the course of hours to the window.
That was the beginning of Erickson calling into question these truths that he was being told about his own abilities.
Once he began getting any kind of muscle movement, he was able to move one finger. He tried to heal himself by imagining that he was swinging from the apple trees in his grandparents' orchard. And by stimulating muscle memory, he was able to regain his use of his legs and so on eventually, and to walk.
He went out into the fields in the winter. The fields were lying fallow, and he got himself on there and he crawled across the fields for hours. That has been a great deal to me over the years as I've struggled against, increasing paralysis.
I think that became the seeds of his interest in hypnosis and non-conscious change. Almost all psychotherapy said, you've got to make the unconscious conscious. Erickson said, no, keep it there, but direct it.
He took a canoe, he bought a canoe, and he told my mother that he was going down the Mississippi River with another roommate because he knew that my mother and dad wouldn't be too happy him going down by himself.
The friend canceled at the last moment and didn't go with him, so Erickson didn't tell his parents about it because he was still using crutches to walk.
But he always says, we are having a good time. And he went down the Mississippi River by himself. And then he'd pull in at night different places. And maybe there where he pulled in there was a farm or someone else, and he would talk to them. But my mother never knew it till he come home.
One of his goals, he told that also that in this connection, was that somebody, when he's coming to a kind of a steep thing in the river, he could not take the boat himself, but he didn't want to ask directly. So he developed a lot of strategies to just sit there, read or do some things until somebody came and said, what do you do here? And do you want to go up or down or so? And then he mentioned that he wants to go this way, but it's a little bit difficult to go there. So he's waiting. So the people offered him to carry the boat, but he never asked them directly. That was his goal, and he managed it.
He never asks. He's too proud. He's not going to beg. He's a proud country boy. And they offer. He puts himself in a position where he indirectly gets them to offer. So he learned these indirect ways of getting people to do things. And later he developed an indirect therapy, where he wouldn't tell people, do this. He'd say, I wonder when you're going to do this.
He left with $4 and ultimately over the summer had a lot of different adventures that are well chronicled in some of the writings. Met many people, made friends, and came back a pretty healthy and robust young man who wasn't using crutches anymore, and he returned with $8 rather than $4, so he doubled his money in the course of his summer trip.
And he was as brown as could be because, of course, at that time all he had to wear was a swimming suit, so he got really tanned up. But he did it more for his body.
Erickson was a student at the University of Wisconsin, and he happened to wander into a graduate training seminar in hypnosis that was being taught by the luminary Clark Hull, one of the earliest learning theorists, later president of the American Psychological Association. Clark Hull was teaching this class on hypnosis, and he was teaching it from a very traditional, scripted, totally one-dimensional format. And Erickson, as a student in the audience, was confident enough, some would say arrogant enough, to say, I can do better than that. And in fact, he proved it, because that summer in between semesters, he went out and got many of the demonstration subjects that Clark Hull had used in his course, and Erickson worked with them hypnotically, devising his own methods, thinking in terms of the individual nature and how to adapt to the individual nature. And just that single realization launches Erickson into a whole new orbit.
I can remember that I held a match, and he says, it isn't hot. I'll tell you when it is hot. But of course, he had to take it out of my hand because I didn't feel it, you know. He used to put me to sleep. He put my youngest sister to sleep and took out her baby teeth that were bad. And that was the first time he showed that you could use hypnosis.
There was a shift in his understanding of life and what you achieve in life. And it went from achieving something through the concrete work of your hands, like lifting a bale of hay or shaking someone's hand, to a recognition that anything of significance that he needed to achieve in life, he could achieve through psychological means and within an interpersonal context. Anything that needs to be achieved in life.
Diagnoses meant very little to him. What he was on to and what he understood was states of consciousness. And he was very interested in helping people shift.
When we shift our states of consciousness, we're very rarely, unless we learn, we are never aware that we go from one state to another. And I think he was profoundly aware of it, and he would move with it.
He was doing all this research into hypnosis, and he was the only one doing all these studies on creating, hallucinations in people and having them see what was there, not see what was there, and all of that kind of, see what wasn't there and not see what was there. And he was doing all these exercises with people. And then that person spoke to an audience and said that hypnosis did not work and denounced it as quackery. And Milton Erickson said, I was just a young student, and I stood up and I raised my hand and I said, sir, I beg to differ with you. You don't know a thing about hypnosis. I've been studying it all year, and these phenomena are absolutely true and correct. And you owe this body an apology for your deception. And he said, that man apologized.
After he graduated, his first job was in a mental hospital. They told him to grow a mustache so he'd look older.
This doctor came up to him and he said, look, Erickson, he said, you're a cripple. And he said, you walk with a cane, you're less of a man. Other people are going to see you as less of a man because of it. And he said, and that's going to allow you to do things that other doctors cannot do. Because you won't be a threat to the females, because you won't be a threat to the other men. And so this is going to give you a real advantage as a doctor. And so here, of course, was this brilliant reframe that allowed Erickson to come to terms with and accept his own limitations, but then to move forward in this spectacular way. And I think you see a lot of that as the essence of Erickson's work, where you have something that's a bad thing. You suffered in childhood, or you became paralyzed from the waist down, or whatever had happened. And somehow he had this ability to take this bad thing and turn it into the springboard that would leap forward. And I think that's the essence of utilization.
Because people treated him like he was a cripple and inferior, he had to always prove he was better than people. He became very competitive in that way. And that's why I said he didn't have many colleagues, because he was always competitive with them in a certain way. He had to be better than them, not just equal to them, better than them, to kind of overcompensate, as Adler would say, for that disability, which was seen at the time, and because people treated him as if he wasn't as good as or wasn't able, he had to prove he was super able.
Erickson had done enough with self-hypnosis that he knew what the possibilities were, and he really wanted to do this inside-out type of therapy rather than outside-in. I'm not telling you that you have to do something. I'm suggesting that you can do something. Let's see what happens.
He was using trance in a fundamentally different way. I like a lot of people, was using trance to get away from the world, to be able to escape. And he was using trance to come into the world. He was using this connection to the creative unconscious to make more connection into the world.
She can remain in this trance the rest of the day. She doesn't know that. She doesn't need to know that she's in a trance. That she is in a trance. And be very comfortable and enjoy your feeling of comfort. I'm going to touch your wrist. No, in our culture it's not common for standing around and let some stranger pick her hand up and leave it suspended in mid-air. And knows quite a number of smiles. The fact that she has a dead hand indicates that there's an absence of self-consciousness. In therapy, you want an absence of self-consciousness. You try to build that up in your way of dealing with your patient. Because when the patient tells you something he's ashamed of, doesn't like to face, doesn't want to admit, he's going to be self-conscious. The person in a hypnotic trance is his own person. He's not an automaton. And he can do what he chooses better than he can in the normal waking state, in the usual waking state. Because in the trance stage, he isn't confused by all the confusion of life that surrounds him. And he gives his attention fully to what the problem is.
He was married before he graduated. She was from Colorado, Denver. Her father was a lawyer. They got a divorce. Carol was about, I think, 2 years old. But nothing much was said. My folks wasn't one that would talk.
We moved from Worcester, Mass. To Michigan, to Eloise. And the divorce was not a happy thing because the feelings on both sides were not good. We would have visits from our mother, our birth mother, but we'd meet in a park somewhere, and Dad would just stand off and wait for the visit to complete. But they were not good times.
We moved to the Eloise, to the hospital, and she didn't come, but she did come finally, and then Dad divorced her. And then we had housekeepers for 2 years, and that wasn't any fun either, because number one thing, they didn't care for looking after kids, but they were young women, and Dad had a phone being a doctor. So that's all he wanted to do was use his phone. But Lance and I didn't enjoy it. in a hospital, in a doctor, there's always social workers and that's looking for a husband. And so there were a lot of them making a play for Dad. But there was one that came more frequently than others, and that was Miss Moore.
Initially, she was his research assistant. He was very impressed and very respectful of her ideas, always consulting with her.
And then one day, Dad come in and said, I want you to meet your new mother. We liked Miss Moore, but then we go in, and where is she? Right there. But that's Miss Moore. Well, she's your new mother. And my brother and I were so happy because Miss Moore was our favorite. And now we had a mother.
I was kind of shocked, to find out that he'd been married before and divorced, because I know he didn't like the idea of divorce particularly. He loved the idea of love at first sight and stay together forever, which was the story of his parents. But he said that, yes, he definitely was very happy not to be married to the first wife, and that when he saw Betty, he said, I knew she was in love with me from the moment I laid eyes on her. But she didn't know she was going to become my wife.
In the earlier years, he didn't have a whole lot of time for family. He would often start at 8 in the morning, sometimes 7, but usually 8. And he would go straight through, sometimes till 10 at night. I remember he was making a film down in the basement, and he was studying color blindness then. I think he was trying to see if people could overcome their color blindness in some way, whether maybe it was a question of partly physical, but partly ideas about color. And he was exploring that.
He would take a diagnostic description of a patient, read it, and then he'd go back to his apartment and he'd write out an imagined history of that patient. And then he'd go and check to see if the history matched.
And then he would do the opposite. He would get a social history and read it, and then he would write out what he believed the mental status examination should be. Then he would take the mental status examination and see if that was correct. He would train himself in so many ways. He was tireless. So he said that when he was starting to study hypnosis, he would write out a 15-page induction, cut it down to a 12-page induction, to a 5-page induction, to a 2-page induction. Then he would deliver it to the patient. So he would train himself on how to use more condensed, experiential, multi-level communication. And he was absolutely tireless about finding ways to train himself, and the stories about his perceptiveness are legendary.
Several times in the literature it is said that Erickson could tell by how a woman sat down whether or not she'd had an extramarital affair. And everyone just accepts that as somehow a skill that he had. Well, John was able to ask him a series of questions that he broke that down.
Milton, are you willing to tell me, how is it then when you look at a woman, suddenly you will say, does your husband know about the affair you've been having? Out of the blue, you say it. And he said it, and there was, in the group, there was a young woman, and he said, would you be the dummy for me? And then she went over and he said, have a seat. And when she sat down, and pretend that you're in therapy with me, and then fold your leg like this, and I can't because my thick thighs, but tuck this toe behind this leg. And he said, when I see a woman do that, I know that she's protecting her self and Never was it wrong. And I've done it many times in my practice, and never has it not been correct that the woman has been having an affair.
I don't know anybody who can begin to match Erickson's skill. His ability to pick up on unconscious communication, to hear little nuances of somebody's sentences that was actually communicating things to him.
A woman who I met at a birthday party, it was a 70th birthday party here in Phoenix, and a woman in her 70s came up to me and she said, "You're Dr. Zeig?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "You're director of the Erickson Foundation?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, I want to tell you a story about meeting Dr. Erickson." I said, "Well, please." She said, "Well, I had never met him before, and I came into the room and he looked up at me and he said, 'You spent your formative years in a concentration camp.'" And she was stunned. And she was true. And she said, "Well, how do you know that?" And he said, "Well, it's the way that you hold your body." And then another story, a patient who came to me who was a previous patient of Dr. Erickson's. I said, "What was it like to be with Dr. Erickson?" She said, "Well, in the first session, he said something to me and I've never forgotten." I said, "What was that?" She said, "Well, he looked up at me and he said, 'You are not your mother's favorite.'" And she said, "Well, no." And he said, "But you were probably your grandmother's favorite, probably your maternal grandmother." And she was stunned.
I said, "How do you think you knew?" And of course, what he says is, in 1952, 2 psychiatrists came to see me for psychotherapy. They were married, and one of them told me that I had known his previous wife, who was also a psychiatrist, and he didn't want to tell me her name because he was afraid it would prejudice me against him in this couple's therapy. But I really wanted to know the name, and I pressed him for the name of his previous wife, but he wouldn't tell me. So the session went on, and about 20 minutes into the session, I got the strangest urge. I stopped the session, I picked up the telephone, and I called my friend Barbara, and I said, "Barbara, this is Dr. Erickson. I don't know why, but I had the strangest urge to call you, and instead of calling you by your real name, Barbara," and then he looked over at the psychiatrist, the man who wasn't going to tell him the name of the ex-wife, and said, "For some reason, I want to call you Nancy." And he looked at the man. The man jumped out of the chair and he said, "That was my ex-wife's name. How did you know it?" "I'll call you back, Barbara." Hangs up the phone. His unconscious mind picked up on certain things that the man had emphasized. For example, maybe the man was telling a story. That year we went to Nantucket, and there you can see whales. And he said, or he said another time, I just felt out to sea. And he kept emphasizing the syllables, Nan and sea, and somehow Erickson's unconscious had processed this. And the therapy proceeds a lot better because he knows the ex-wife, who the ex-wife is.
When you can really focus with that level of intensity and be that aware of on so many different levels, the nature of the brain and the genetic shifts in the brain-body-mind system is such that you are amplifying intelligence in ways that seem to be more mythic than real.
He had this basic, fundamental faith in the unconscious that was real, and the unconscious being the natural part of the human being that we all have. And it really is a matter of awakening that, bringing that out in the person, and being so sure of it.
He would sometimes hypnotize himself just before he saw the person and give himself an amnesia. And then when the person walked into his office as his client, it was for the first time. Because he believed that sometimes when you meet someone for the first time, you have an immediate impression and you have understandings, and they're spontaneous and new, and they could be very useful.
But he says, I want you to do 2 things before you come back. And don't call me about coming back until you have done these 2 things. And he said, I want you to take a course in anatomy. I don't think that anyone should be a therapist unless they understand the human body, because you can learn so much from the body that does not lie that you can't learn simply from asking questions and interacting with a person. And the second thing I want you to do is to practice observation skills. I'd like you to go into restaurants or go into stores or at family gatherings, and I want you to pick a group of people to observe, to look at. But I don't want you to ask yourself, why are they doing what they're doing? I want you to get away from wanting to know why. And what I would like you to do is to see if you can learn what they're doing means. What is the meaning of what they are doing? And practice your skills at doing that.
Twice a month, he lectured on Wednesday. And when I was old enough, Dad encouraged me to come. And I found him very interesting, and I would talk to Dad later about what I thought the patients, some of their problems might be. And Dad was intrigued with his son being able to do that, but I could not get excited about it because there were just too many drawbacks to it. I wanted to be around people that didn't have problems. So my dad was discouraged. And because he'd already told his sisters and all that, oh, of course, Bert will be a doctor. And a little bit of resentment when I didn't from my dad.
Daddy did a lot for the war effort, some of which is still held by the government.
He helped J. Edgar Hoover, and we got a letter from him. They had some espionage going on where the enemy had taken this American and trying to get some secrets out of him or something. The enemy had taken him in a car ride to a place where they interrogated him. When they found him later, he was unconscious. But he was back where they'd picked him up. And they wanted to know if Dad could do anything about him getting his memory back. So Dad was able to get him into a trance and duplicate the route he made, where he swung and where they went forward, where there was a stoplight and so on. And the FBI thanked Dad for his part and said they had completed it. They had found it. So I didn't know any more than that, but I just knew that Dad was there, and of course it was all secret stuff, so we were just proud that our dad had an effort in the war effort, even though he couldn't go into the service.
Milton told me that a Jewish man, and he knew I was Jewish, a Jewish man came to see him before Hitler actually became the Fuhrer. And he described what Hitler was saying about the Jews. And Erickson told me, I told that man, after I listened to everything he said, that if he believed what he said, he ought to go back to Germany and kill this Hitler. If you've ever watched Hitler's film, The Triumph of the Will, it is a completely hypnotically designed video. You begin in the tape in an airplane with Hitler. You arrive with Hitler down looking out over the German people, and you are one with this event. And Hitler probably studied hypnosis and actually trained his voice, because he had a high squeaky voice, to speak more deeply and slowly so that he could become someone else. So, you know, it's not so mysterious or woo-woo as it would sound. It's once you've cleared away all the obstacles, which is what hypnosis does, and you created a climate of receptivity and the rapport, the person is available to receive your message. Now, as Jay Haley said, it is a very good thing that Milton Erickson was benevolent, and therefore, when he transmitted very good messages for people, benevolent, what was good for them. If he had been a dangerous or harmful person, he could have done a lot of harm.
The neighbors had a dog. One of the other doctor's families had a dog, and the dog ran in front of the bicycle when Dad was bicycling home.
He rode a bike, in spite of his bad leg, during the war, trying to save gas, and a dog had bit him.
Dad fell off the bike and they gave him a shot of tetanus. But tetanus at that time was made from horse serum,
which sent him into anaphylactic shock.
Dad, with that serum sickness, would arch and it would throw him off the bed. So we had to stay with him 24 hours a day, making sure that he stayed on the bed and he could eat almost nothing. He almost died a number of times.
And Dr. DeYoung told us that the prognosis isn't good. But the doctors had told Dad that he would be lucky to live to be 45. And so now he's 45, and maybe that preyed not on his mind, but anyway, he was there, and the doctors told Mom that, here, he's right in the center of all this pollen. So Mom talked to Dr. DeYoung and said, is there anything we can do? And Dr. DeYoung said, well, if you get him to the Sahara Desert, he might be able to. So she did the next best thing. She got him to Arizona. And Mom was so good because she had remembered a colleague of Dad's, Dr. Larson, that was in Arizona now at the state hospital. And so he worked with Dr. Larson for several months, 9 months or so, and then they bought a home of their own. And there, it had that extra room, and Dad set up practice and went into private practice. I can remember his first patient.
He started out with his office in the home because he wasn't in very good health and he could rest between patients. But it worked so well, and we became a part of a lot of the therapy, both known and unbeknownst to us.
We had many guests that would come, like Margaret Mead would come and Gregory would come, and they would almost vanish into other rooms, and we'd see them. I always felt lucky because I always got to give my bed to Margaret when she slept at the house.
Living in the house and my dad being in the office, 7 in the morning till 11 at night. But a nice thing for the children was when the patients weren't there, the door was always open. Office was in our home, so we could wander in, wander out, sit in the patient's chair, read. He'd point out a thing or two. You could talk with him. So we felt that he was at home with us, and he'd take a break and make us a popcorn or whatever, chat a little and go back in the office. So he worked very long hours, but he built in a lot of interactions with the children as well.
And he always relaxed in his office by sitting at his desk and writing, and that was his passion. It was like he was so filled with ideas that were just spilling over onto the paper, and he could hardly write fast enough to get them all down.
I had learned in school, I was a nurse, and I had learned that professional people had a lot of trappings, I would call it, that they had artificial things that suggested that they were successful, i.e. offices and nice draperies and beautiful artwork and so forth, and that you were very remote with your patients, you kept a distance. And then I'd go and see Dad working with clients in his house, in his little 3-bedroom, 1-office house, living room being the waiting room, and observing him, working with them as though they're people, not patients, not even clients, but people. That was a very, very important learning for me when I was first starting as a professional.
He had Native American blood flowing in his veins, so he was always very kind to American Indians, any indigenous culture. He literally supported an Indian tribe I think it was the Sonora Desert, someplace in Mexico. They earned their living by making these ironwood carvings, beautiful carvings of animals, things from nature. And Erickson would buy one, buy two. By the time I saw him, his living room, his whole house, his office was covered with these ironwood carvings.
Suppose you demonstrate to the people here what it is to go into auto-hypnosis. You can talk freely, talk rapidly. Don't take over 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
That's right.
I won't be able to tell them very much.
Well, talk fast.
Well, to go into an auto-hypnotic trance, you don't deliberately try to do anything. You just put yourself into a rather passive state, and what I like to do is to keep my eyes open and fixate my gaze on some rather bright point of light, although many people like to shut their eyes. And you don't exactly look at it, you just allow it to occupy the center of your attention and just wait.
The family was a close family, but the borders kind of blurred as far as their friendships. You always felt that you would be included and respected. There were a few times when I was recruited to help Dr. Erickson, and I can remember one that there was a lady that needed someone to eat lunch with her and to swim with her. And so I had the privilege of going where she was staying, swimming, eating lunch, and the clue was that she was not allowed to complain, and if she did, I was to divert the conversation.
Patients would become part of his intimate family who would introduce them to his children. They would stay with him. He had his office in his house, and his house was always open. It would not be done nowadays. It crosses too many boundaries.
I would go walking with Robert almost every afternoon, and we would go shopping. We got in the habit of having our haircuts together every month, went to movies, and Roxy and Christy would come over and I'd make them dinner. And they taught me how to iron clothes, so I did all my own ironing.
Where we had these great big Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas dinners, you know, and I would make a point of sitting near the door as close as I could. And he understood that, because I was very brave to do that, because they were all strangers to me at that point.
He always called me the greeter of his when he was seeing patients in the house. He always called me the greeter of his patients. But even looking back on that to the time when I was a little kid crawling around on the floor in the living room, which was a waiting room, I was like thrilled that some new person was coming over that would potentially play with me, and you know, and we learned the rules, so we didn't, you know, if they weren't interested in playing with us, so we left them alone and we're respectful and stuff. But it seemed like everybody who walked down through the door was a potential playmate, and I would greet them enthusiastically, and sometimes I would get a positive response, and sometimes I would be ignored, and that was okay.
I have my favorites that were over. Mr. Getz was one of my favorites. Without Mr. Getz, I never would have passed Spanish in high school. He helped me get Spanish, and he taught me chess, and the way he'd do it is I would come over to my Spanish lesson, and when I had my Spanish learned enough, he would let me play chess with him. Now, I didn't learn why Mr. Getz was at my father's house till many years later, but he was there and he was a presence in my life.
He might bring one of the girls in when they were little to talk with a patient about the way in which a child perceives the world so that the patient can get a better understanding of scope and depth. He might have brought one of the girls in to do hypnosis and demonstrated hypnosis for the patient so that the patient could have a better understanding of what hypnosis was. I remember one patient, she went through an alcoholic period. Well, rather than having her hospitalized, Erickson had his daughters, who were teenagers at the time, Christy and Roxy, and they babysat the patient. He had Robert, who was good at finding things, go over to her home and case out the home and make sure that she wasn't hiding alcohol anyplace. So this was Erickson's approach to family therapy. Erickson's approach to family therapy was his family did therapy with the patient.
I remember coming home from school one day and seeing a young man, patient of his, sitting on the cross-legged on the front lawn. And I said, "Hi, what you doing?" Because I knew him and liked him. And he said, "Your father has put me out in the front yard, and I am supposed to find as many colors green in the lawn as I can find." And I thought 2 square foot patch of the lawn. And I thought, well, that sounds like kind of fun. So we sat together and we counted the different shades of green, had these pleasant kind of arguments that you have, like, does dead grass count, if it's those kind of arguments. It was very pleasurable. And so we counted, and then after a while I went in the house, and I asked Daddy, why is he out there counting, looking at the colors of green? And Daddy said his usual answer, because I told him so. Oh, okay. Decades later, I was demonstrating hypnosis and to a gentleman, and when the gentleman left, Daddy's final assignment to him was, I want you to read the newspaper comic strips, every one of them, and tell me which ones make you laugh. So he left, and I said, "Okay, Daddy, how come you never told me to do this?" And Daddy said, "Because you don't need to figure out ways to make you laugh or to enjoy life." And it was like a lightning bolt. Suddenly I understood why that man was counting the different shades of green. And I said, that's why he was doing the green. And of course, this gentleman was gone decades. And Daddy said, "Took you long enough."
Milton was like a shaman willing to prescribe ritual, give people tasks, even ordeals, things that were painful and uncomfortable and disquieting. And he would send them out to do things that filled them with anxiety. People don't do that much anymore, even though he provided a context in which not only it was safe, but in which people could explore the familiar in this new way.
I published a paper on a man who lost his wife. He and his widowed son lived together, and they did their own housework. They ran their own real estate office, and they divided the homework. And the old man finally came to me and he said, "I'll lie awake all night long and fast and try to go to sleep. And I never get more than 2 hours sleep. I usually fall asleep about 5 o'clock, and I wake up at 7. And all right, now you want correction for your insomnia. All you have to do is do what I say. Say you and your son divide up the housework. How do you divide it up?" He said, "My son does the things he likes to do. I do the things we like to do." I said, "What do you hate doing most?" He said, "Waxing the floor. We've got hardwood floors, and I like to keep them waxed. Now, I'll do everything I have to do and what my son has to do if he will wax the floors, because I can't stand waxing the floor." And I said, "All right, I have a remedy in mind for you. It will cost you 8 hours sleep. Do you think you can afford 8 hours loss of sleep? He said, I've been losing that much sleep every night for a year. Of course I can afford it. I said, all right. Tonight when you go home, you take a jar of Johnson's floor wax and a rag, and you polish the floor all night long. You polish it too. Usually getting up time in the morning. Then you go about the day's work, you won't lost 2 hours sleep. And the next night, you start waxing the floor. At bedtime, you wax it all night long. And go to the office sometime. That'll be a total of 4 hours sleep loss. Next night, you polish the floor all night long and lose another 2 hours sleep. On the 4th night, before I began polishing the floor, I told his son, I think I'll rest my eyes for a minute. He woke up at 7 o'clock the next morning. And now I'm a dressed can of Johnson floor wax and a polishing rag. And I've told him, you got an illuminated dial clock. If you can read the time of the night on my clock 15 minutes after you go to bed, you polish the floor all night long. He hasn't missed a night's sleep since.
There was no existing model of psychotherapy that you could use to put on the initial situation and predict the outcome. You could put a theory on it in the end and say, oh, well, you see, this was the gestalt that moved into the foreground. But it wasn't the kind of usefulness of the theory that would allow you to create the intervention. And it boggled my mind. It really disturbed me because I was the kind of kid that I had to figure stuff out. I had to take my toys apart before I got home from the store. And I couldn't figure this one out.
Somewhere in the, I want to say, early to middle 1950s, my father was really becoming well respected. Following that article appearing in this nationwide publication, countless people would write him. And I can remember how my mother would write letters to the post office thanking them because the article in the magazine only identified him as being a physician in Phoenix, Arizona, no street address. And so people from literally all over the world, having read the article, would simply address it to Milton H. Erickson, care of Phoenix, Arizona.
At that time, it seemed there were a lot of people in the scientific world, in the psychotherapy world that said, oh, Erickson, and they tended to put him down. They really did not understand what we call his genius today because he was so different.
A lot of people call him the crazy man out in Phoenix. Oh, you could not have had a gathering in the 60s and 70s where Milton Erickson's name came up, where the idea of whether or not he was psychotic didn't come up. It was the psychoanalytic heyday. Anything that would talk about short-term therapy, focused psychotherapy, solution-focused psychotherapy, was all considered a kind of heresy. You didn't deviate.
In that particular time, there was a lot of involvement in theory with the analytic conception that the unconscious is a reservoir of negativity and problems. And Erickson was the early proponent of the idea that the unconscious is really healthy and is positive, and that the conscious mind is where a lot of the problems are. He trusted that unconscious. He believed in accessing it. And so it was always a potential, and a positive potential, rather than one where you're pushing all of the garbage and the refuse down into.
You never talk in any of the classical analytical terms. And
most psychiatrists don't understand that themselves, and why should you expect a patient?
Right. But even talking to psychiatrists, you don't use that terminology. Even writing papers, you don't use that terminology.
I want to express my idea. I don't want to recite what I've read.
Right.
Every year, it seems, the president of the American Psychological Association comes out with a brand new comprehensive theory of psychology. Mm-hmm. There'll be another one next year. Mm-hmm. The psychiatrists come out with a brand new comprehensive, and everybody in psychiatry wants to make a name for himself by attaching his name to a hypothetical, theoretical system. And I think you should bear in mind that a human being is a human being, and that's been the case for millions of years. Mm-hmm. And each patient that comes to you is strictly an individual whom you don't know, and he doesn't know you, and the interaction between you and him is something to be discovered. And now, approached by the Adlerian, the Freudian, the Stickian, Rogerian, or Meyerian, existentialist, and so on.
He didn't like the fact that people were ignoring him, but he didn't take it personally.
He genuinely believed that every therapist needed to develop their own theory, their own methods, their own style. So he, at least as he came across to me, he was not trying to develop one more system of therapy.
Erickson was not a great self-promoter. He really liked doing the work he did. He was okay in the hypnosis and, medical and dental hypnosis fields. But, I lived in Phoenix, where Erickson was a psychiatrist and he was in practice. I never heard of Erickson before I read Jay Haley's Uncommon Therapy. So Jay Haley made him well known. And then Bandler and Grinder, who went all around the world, said they had extracted some of his patterns and put them into their neurolinguistic programming. Both of those two were a big shift in awareness of Erickson's work.
I was looking for any form of answer, and as you dig into the psychological literature, you come across some people that are giants of the field, and I picked up one of Jay Haley's books early on, and I read My Voice Will Go With You, and I was fascinated by the fact that intuitively I've always believed that people have all the answers inside, and that the unconscious is there, and I've always been good at going into trance. I think anybody who creates change is. I personally believe all change happens in a trance. But what people think of as trance, and traditionally somebody directly forcing you to do something versus a natural occurring state that hopefully you learn to utilize, I think that those distinctions I was able to refine initially by the book.
Now today what I think I'll do is to give you a purely psychological problem. I'll ask you to try to understand it. I do a lot of hopeless things like that.
We can think about Erickson as having three careers. One career was his first career, which was as a researcher, and that was primarily when he was working at Eloise Hospital in Michigan. His second career was his career as a psychotherapist here in Phoenix. And his third career, when he retired, which was about 1974, then his teaching seminars became popular because with the work of people like Rossi and Haley, then Erickson became so widely known that people came literally from all over the world to sit with him and to listen to him. And unexpectedly, Erickson had his third career doing teaching.
A lot of people came to see him, and every now and then he'd be able to collect somebody who also shared with him that idea that it was fun to learn things.
There'd be 10 or even 12 people that were jammed into this little room to listen to him, and he would say, I charge $40 an hour. Now, if there's 10 of you here, each of you can pay $4. If you don't have any money, you don't have to pay. If you have more, you're welcome to pay more.
$4 with the world master of hypnotherapy. I could cry when I think about it, because he could have charged by everybody $1,200 a week, but he insisted. He wanted $40 for the hour, and that's it. So we split the whole amount. If you look around now, it's a little bit different.
He leaned over his wheelchair and attempted to pick up a stone, a large stone, this big around. And leans over the wheelchair, and then with one hand and ultimately then with two hands makes a great effort to pick this stone up. My initial response is, I want to get up and help him. I am, after all, a physician, a psychiatrist. He was laboring, but I was restrained by some inner driver. But he must have seen me move, some tiny movement that was virtually reflexive. But he didn't say anything, and he kept laboring at picking this stone up. Finally, he grabbed it with two hands, and then with great effort, moved it into his lap. And then with a lightning flash of the wrists, he threw the stone directly at me. Directly at me. And startled, I picked my hands up and caught the stone just as it was about to land in my crotch. And I discovered that the stone was not a stone at all. It was foam rubber. It was light. It was made out of this material that weighed nothing at all. That the entire effort was an absolute charade. And he looked at me and he said, the way you see it is not the way it is.
We have all these stories about how sweet he was, you know, particularly as this older sort of Yoda-like figure, that he was just playful. He was also a pretty stern Zen master, you know, whacking you over the head. And what he would whack you over the head about is if you developed a fixed understanding. You know, he would say psychotherapists do not have the luxury of having a theory.
Here was Erickson. He was in a wheelchair. His vision is doubled, his hearing is impaired, he's breathing by virtue of a few intercostal muscles and half a diaphragm. You could hear his labored breathing because it was, he almost had to concentrate on each breath. It wasn't, you know, just normal unconscious breathing. He's in constant chronic pain, and he just exudes being glad to be alive.
He had this characteristic way that he would drop his head and he would talk and just a little bit side to side. And then when an anecdote would come to the end, he would lift his head and look around at everybody, and just, he had that smile on his face, and everybody would just kind of stare back at him. And then if somebody summoned the energy to ask a question, then he again would consider the question and drop his head, and off he'd go again. And some of the stories were an hour long. He had this capacity to just keep going. Looking back on it, and of course I listened to the tapes over and over in the subsequent years, looking back on it, it was just an absolute goldmine of clinical material. But he was talking about his dogs, and he was talking about when his parents moved west. You know, it wasn't a direct clinical experience.
When we were alone with him once, he said, Milton, when you tell those stories, do you go into a trance and let your unconscious mind tell the story? And he said, yes. When I lean down, I look at that rug, and the rug draws me into a trance, and I just let go, and the story tells itself. My unconscious tells the story.
Rather than giving people information, he would create experiences. he would give people little experiences, and these experiences could be in the form of a task, a directive, a line of poetry, a metaphor, a story, a hypnosis. So in my way of understanding Dr. Erickson, I think about hypnosis as being just one of a number of experiential methods that he would use. He would come in with this, and he would say, when students come in, they come in like this. But when they leave like this. And, enjoy that experiential moment and prime people for the idea that this lesson was not going to be about content, it was going to be about experience.
I made him this gift, which was his and Betty's, one of their very favorite gifts. She said not a day went by when Milton didn't take this off the wall to show it to visiting guests. And it's based on a puzzle that he used to tell people of how is it possible that a farmer would plant 5 rows of trees, 4 trees each row, 10 trees total. And the answer is this configuration. But what I did was all the stories of his life that Milton shared with me over the years, I put them on here about where he was born, about his relationships, and so on. And when I told him that this was a present that would be his favorite present, and he said, "Why is that?" And I said, "Because it's for your wife." He got tears in his eyes. And it was the only time I ever saw him get tears in his eyes.
One day while I was there, he says, "Can you tell when someone's hypnotized?" And people gave various answers, like a person's face tends to become asymmetrical at first, and then it becomes symmetrical and more flaccid, and their breathing slows. And they give all this stuff, all these, intellectual ideas. And he listened very carefully to all of these. And then he turned to a woman who was about 3 people away around this little circle. He says, "Mary, where are we?" She goes, "Up in the apple tree." And he had zoned her through the floor, and nobody had noticed. When he asked, "Can you tell when someone's hypnotized?" he meant right now. And none of us knew. And then he asked this lady, "And what's my name?" She goes, "Tommy." He just totally zoned her through the floor. And we who were trying to learn how to do what he was doing and learn from him didn't notice at all what he had done. Didn't notice at all. He was quite willing to rub our noses in our incompetence to get across the importance of right now and noticing what's happening rather than all this intellectualizing and stuff.
He was indeed, there's no question about it. He was a very controlling, very influential, and dare I even use the word manipulative person. And I say that hesitantly, but I also say that very purposefully too. And when I use manipulation or comment on it, colleagues often react and say, "Well, you don't manipulate." But if you don't manipulate, you don't bring about change.
He did things that were, a lot of people would think are on the edge of a little bit of torture, like one woman who couldn't control her child. He had her, when the child obeyed, instead of hitting her or doing something like that, he had her sit on her. And sit on her until, or him, I forget whether it was a boy or girl, until they quieted down, and then to say what he was doing. And there were several other examples like that.
Erickson was a person who tended to over-punish. You see what I'm saying? That's why his wife was so important. Because, that's one of 100 reasons. But she would call him back from the abyss. But he was so annoyed with me that he wouldn't be called back. When my parents were in the picture, the situation was so confusing to me that I simply didn't face things. I had missed out on the acquisition of a lot of basic life skills. And he said, I think that you need complete isolation from your parents. Therefore, I'm going to tell you that you may now no longer talk to your father or your mother or anybody else in your family until I tell you you can.
My biological mom and I went out for lunch, and she said, Dr. Erickson tried to put a wedge between us. So then the next time I saw Dr. Erickson, I told him, I said, Mom says you tried to put a wedge between us, and he didn't say a word. But you know, I hardly ever saw her again. I didn't want to.
I did not go home again until June of my junior year in college. So I was away from home for 2 years.
Did he go too far at times on that? He went further than what I would choose today. He went further than people back in his times at times thought acceptable.
They considered him to be harsh, sadistic. I think that for his patients, what others considered to be harsh or sadistic was for the patient a not unreasonable choice. So he was really treading in a huge minefield, and he was able to navigate his way through that. I don't know that today would be necessary to go into the minefield to be able to arrange in some form for the vulnerable person to be able to be protected, because that really was what it was all about.
He was such an optimistic person. He believed everybody could change. And on couples, every once in a while, he'd give up on them really quickly. Like, what? Why? And maybe because his first marriage didn't work out, I think he had the idea some marriages just aren't going to work. They're just not going to work. Why bother working on them? But he made that conclusion sometimes after one meeting with him.
It was a piece that didn't fit with the rest of him. But it was a very, very obvious to many people.
I felt a little sorry for myself, really, that I had two parents, neither of whom could carry on a conversation. My mother had this encyclopedic memory, and you'd ask her a question, and she'd still be reciting. It was always very fascinating and unbelievable that she could retain all that information. Very brilliant woman, but it really wasn't conversative. You know, it was more informational, you know, providing. And so Mom was not really a conversationalist, and Dad really wasn't a conversationalist. And so sometimes I'd feel, gosh, I wish he would just, you know, be ordinary and say, give me a pat on the back and say, have a nice day, or something like that. And that really, it wasn't ordinary in that way.
I was sitting in his office, and Betty wheeled him in, and I was there just by myself with Erickson, and I felt overwhelmed with the possibility, with the opportunities, with what could happen. And he didn't say anything, and I was looking around and getting more and more self-conscious and more overwhelmed by what could happen. And he started looking around the room, didn't say anything, looked at me every now and again. And he was not doing anything to help me. He wasn't asking any questions to make it easier for me. And after about 10 minutes, he picked up the phone and he said to Betty, take me back into the house. He dismissed me for the day. If I wasn't forthcoming, if I wasn't willing to make the first step, forget it.
He would absolutely not teach everyone that came along. And he would not actually take every patient that wanted to come and see him. And sometimes he would test their dedication and motivation. How much do you really want to see me? But he would never be that direct. So he wouldn't make the person defensive of, well, I want to see you so much, I'll pay you 3 times your fee. He would never do that. But what he would do is he would say, I want you to climb Squaw Peak every day for a week. For those people who have never climbed Squaw Peak, you have no idea how difficult that climb is. You have to be determined, you have to be in good physical shape, you have to plan your day to be able to get up there, and in my case, you better have some Band-Aids for those blisters on your feet. It is a really strenuous climb up to the top of Squaw Peak. And I would think that for those people who Erickson wanted to do a little testing. You know, how much do you want to really change? How much are you motivated to work? He would say things like that, and he would give them these assignments that were not a walk in the park.
I met this woman one time who had studied with Dr. Erickson in one of those teaching seminars he did right near the end of his life, and she told me, psychologist, and she told me that she was very honored because at a certain point during the seminar, he asked her to stay after when everybody else went, and he said, I'd like to give you some cuttings from my garden for you to take home. And so she went out, and he gave her a garden shears, and there he was in his wheelchair, and he said, okay, cut here, that's good enough. Cut here, take a cutting here, that's good enough, that's good enough. He took her to 3 or 4 plants, and she was very honored. She took these home, and she sprouted them, and she still has some of those plants. And about 10 years later, she was going through a really difficult time, and she all of a sudden, spontaneously, heard Dr. Erickson's voice saying, that's good enough, again and again, which he said when he asked her to do the cuttings. And she realized she was always self-critical, and he had given her a counter message to that. That's good enough. And I certainly had that experience, that things he said to me would come back to me very vividly, or sometimes very non-consciously, but I just felt that influence many years later.
He gave me the therapy. I may have paid him the occasional $10. But I mean, basically it was gratis. I learned to cook. I learned to live on a budget. I'd never done that before. And I went to ASU and I talked my way into honors classes, which I should never have been in, did well. And one day, I was riding home on my bicycle. And as I rode down towards my house, all of a sudden I realized that I was happy. I was really happy for the first time in my life, in my memory anyway. I was doing well in school. People liked having me around. They sought out my opinions. I was happy. And that was a big moment for me.
I got so independent, he had me traveling all over the state in my car, before I gave up my car. And because he knew that I wouldn't be traveling much later on, And yes, he stressed all independence so that I would be separated from my parents. I am with the Erickson family now. That's my home.
The most personal thing he ever said to me was once he was waiting outside the room where the group was waiting to meet with him. I think that may have been the last time I saw him. It would have been 1979. And he said, just asked him casually, how are you feeling, Milton? And he looked at me and he said, if I could cry, Sid, I would. If I could cry, Sid, I would. It really caught me by surprise. And I didn't expect any. So I tried to think of something to say. And I guess I reacted honestly the way he did. I mean, he was honest, I was honest. I said, well, I didn't try to reassure him or anything. I couldn't do that. I just said, well, I guess knowing the consequences, you prefer, or knowing the options, you prefer to experience pain in order to stay alive, to be alive. And he nodded his head, yes, like that.
There was a traffic accident when I was an intern. And a young woman brought in, had been struck by the car. She had 4 or 5 children. Her husband was obviously in love with her. I did the examination, and she said, "I won't live, will I?" I said, "No, you won't." She said, "My husband, my children should have a happy memory of me. No, don't tell them I'm dying, but bring them in and help me converse with them, and let's have happy topics. And when you see my strength is failing fast, give me a sign, and then I'll say goodbye for now to them, and you have them go out and let me die in peace." Mm-hmm. So for about 1 hour, it was a very delightful conversation where she reminisced over all the happy times for her husband, for the children. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think death should be approached.
Mm-hmm. People should be able to choose the way they want to die.
They should be able to choose, and they should not be oppressed by somebody else's concept of what should take place in the deathbed.
Yeah.
After Dr. Erickson died, he did want to be cremated, and so the family, Mrs. Erickson and Betty Alice and Robert and Christy and Roxy and myself and my then wife Sharon, we all took the urn of ashes up Squaw Peak. And it was a moonlit night. And Robert got to the very top of Squaw Peak, and he held the ashes up in his hands, and it was symbolic, like Dr. Erickson had finally made it to the top for getting his vaster perspective and higher point of view.
I think he's had far more influence outside of this country than here in this country. South America, Mexico, Europe, a much more profound influence. And I think we need to move in that direction. I think that what has happened here in this country, where Erickson lived and worked and studied, has been to move away from helping patients become the principal agents in their own healing.
What turns the mind on? They find that novelty, enrichment, anything that's new, and exercise, both mental and physical exercise. These are the 3 things that we can do in everyday life to actually turn on the genes and neurons of our brain. So Erickson was practicing what we might say is modern neuroscience way back before neuroscience had discovered it.
The greatest influence is to really understand that, in my life, I guess, that the other than conscious mind is the most powerful force in the universe, certainly the most powerful force in human beings, and that all you have to do is cultivate it and activate it and respect it in other human beings. And any problem that a human being has was created by a human being, so it can be solved by a human being. And I think that philosophy and belief has allowed me to do things that would have seemed miraculous to me at an early stage of my life, and today I expect to be able to create.
More than 30 years after his death, his contribution continues. People continue to study his work. There's a lot to be mined that we still don't understand. One of the ways that we can study him is by referencing art, by referencing the structure of art and comparing the things that Dr. Erickson did with the things that artists of all disciplines, the things that artists of all disciplines do.
I think we still have more that we have in mind from his American genius, his therapeutic genius, that I would love to have the next generation of people get inspired and get excited about him and find and extract more of what Erickson had to teach us, even though he's no longer here. There's some records of his work. I would love to learn more about how Erickson did what he did. I think I've absorbed some of it, and it's made me a much better therapist.
For a young woman in a field that was and is male-dominated, he took me absolutely seriously. He taught me how to conduct myself. He taught me so many lessons. And at the end of this study, right before he died, I told you he gave me a gift. He gave me an ironwood bird, as if he hadn't given me enough. And then he said to me, "Now, Michelle, how are you going to repay me?" And I said, "Oh my God, Milton, I don't know. I didn't realize that of course I must repay you, but I stammered." And he said, "Let me tell you a story." And he told me how he was a young farm boy and that he had found out he had a wealthy aunt. And he went to see this aunt, and he said, "I was so primitive that I'd read that when you visit the wealthy, you should wear gloves. So I wore my farm gloves to see my aunt. And I went to her and asked her would she put me through school. And she said yes, she would. And she put me through undergraduate school. And then I came back to her and said, I want to become a doctor. And she said, I'll put you through medical school, Milton. And I did well, and I was a serious student, and I came back to her to thank her. And she said to me, "Now, Milton, how will you repay me?" And he said, "I stammered like you did." And she said, "I'll give you two choices, Milton. You can either repay me with money, or you can become a great healer." And this I chose the second one.